The static of a radio can hide a lot of things: distance, bad weather, maybe even the truth. In 1942, while the world was at war, a different kind of enemy was waking up in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest. Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Tonight, we are climbing 6 miles up to a jagged spine of rock known as Station 4. We're looking into the case of Thomas Braden, a man who built his life on silence, only to vanish, leaving behind a single, terrifying phone call and a cabin locked from the outside. If you enjoy peeling back the layers of the unexplained, go ahead and punch that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments, do you think the woods are watching you back? Now, let's get into tonight's story. The chilling final call of Station 4. The year was 1942. The world was on fire. In Europe and the Pacific, the Second World War was raging, but on the quiet, wind-swept peaks of the American Pacific Northwest, the war felt both incredibly distant and terrifyingly close. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor just months prior, the entire west coast of the United States was in a state of high anxiety. There were rumors of Japanese submarines surfacing off the coast of Oregon, of saboteurs landing on beaches, and of secret aircraft designed to set the endless American forests ablaze. It was in this atmosphere of tension that a man named Thomas Braden found himself stationed at one of the most remote outposts in the Cascade Range. Thomas was not your typical fire lookout. At 35 years old, he was older than many of the college students who usually took the summer jobs, and he was far more serious. He was a man who, by all accounts, craved the silence. Friends and family, what few he had described him as steady and unflappable. The kind of guy who could sit in a room for hours without saying a word and be perfectly content. In the spring of 1942, Thomas was assigned to the Iron Mountain Lookout. Some records suggest it may have been the nearby Granite Peak, but the logs simply refer to Station 4. It was a 14 by 14-foot wooden cab perched on a jagged spine of rock, miles from the nearest logging road, and surrounded by a sea of green Douglas firs that stretched to the horizon. To get there, Thomas had to hike 6 miles uphill with a 60-pound pack. Once he arrived, he was effectively on another planet. His only lifeline to the rest of humanity was a fragile, crank-operated telephone line that snaked down the mountain, through the trees, to the ranger station in the valley below. For the first 3 months of his assignment, everything was routine. Thomas Braden was the model lookout. Every morning at 8, he would call in his status check to the dispatcher, a man named Ranger Miller. Station 4, clear, Braden would say. His voice was always calm, almost monotone. Ranger Miller, who was used to the young lookouts getting stir-crazy and wanting to chat for 20 minutes about baseball or girls, actually found Braden's brevity a bit unsettling. Braden never complained about the heat. He never complained about the bugs. He never asked for extra supplies. He just watched the horizon. But in late August of 1942, something changed. The logs recovered from the lookout, which I'll get to in a minute, show that the weather had turned unseasonably strange. A heavy, oppressive fog had rolled into the valleys, but the peaks remained clear, sticking out of the cloud layer like islands in a white ocean. It was a phenomenon known as an inversion, and it played tricks on the sound. Noises from the valley floor, miles away, could sometimes be heard clearly at the summit, while a shout from 50 feet away might be muffled. On August 28, 1942, Thomas Braden missed his 8-morning check-in. This was unprecedented. In 90 days of service, Braden had never been a minute late. Ranger Miller sat by the radio in the dispatch office, staring at the clock. 8:05, 8:10, 8:15. Miller tried to ring the lookout. He grabbed the crank on the side of his phone and gave it a long, hard turn. Ring, ring, ring. Silence. He tried again. Ring, ring, ring. Nothing. Miller wasn't panicked yet, but he was concerned. Storms often knocked out the flimsy phone lines. A branch might have fallen across the wire somewhere down the trail. Miller made a note in his logbook. Station 4 silent. Possible line break. He decided to wait until the scheduled 1600 4 p.m. check-in. If Braden didn't call by then, Miller would send a runner up the trail. The hours ticked by. The sun began to dip toward the western ridges, casting long, jagged shadows across the valley. At 3:55 p.m., Ranger Miller was sitting at his desk, his hand already resting on the phone, waiting. At 4 p.m. exactly, the phone rang. Miller snatched it up. Dispatch. Miller speaking. Static. Station 4? Miller asked. Braden? Is that you? For a long moment, there was only the crackle of the line, the sound of atmospheric interference that sounds like bacon frying. Then, a voice cut through the static. It was Thomas Braden. But he didn't sound like the steady, unflappable man Miller had known all summer. He sounded breathless, terrified. Miller, Braden whispered, They aren't trees. Miller frowned, gripping the receiver tighter. Say again, Thomas? The line is bad. You missed your morning check. I see them, Braden said, his voice rising in pitch. Down in the bowl. The fog cleared for a second. I saw them moving. Saw who moving? Miller asked, thinking immediately of the Japanese invasion rumors. Are they soldiers? Thomas, are you reporting a fire or activity? Not soldiers, Braden said. The fear in his voice was palpable now, a trembling vibration that traveled miles down the copper wire. I thought they were snags, burned trees, but they moved. They're coming up the spine. Miller, they're tall. Thomas, listen to me, Miller said, using his command voice. You've been up there too long. You're seeing shadows. It's the inversion. No, Braden shouted, and the sudden volume made Miller jump. Listen to me. I locked the door. I locked the shutters, but they're outside. I can hear them scratching on the catwalk. Miller heard a sound, then a distinct metallic scritch-scratch sound, like a nail being dragged across a chalkboard, coming through the receiver. It was so loud, it drowned out the static. Thomas, Miller said, his heart hammering, do not go outside. Stay in the cab. I'm sending boys up now. Do you have your service weapon? The gun? Braden let out a strangled laugh. The gun won't work. I tried. The pin, it just bent. Miller, they want the eyes. That's what they said. They want the eyes. Who said that? The message, Braden whispered. The fire. It's not on the ground. The fire is inside them. Suddenly, the scratching noise on the other end stopped. The line went dead silent. Not the silence of a disconnect, but the silence of a room where someone is holding their breath. Thomas? Miller said. Oh God, Braden whispered. The voice was so close to the mouthpiece that it sounded like he was inside Miller's head. They're looking in the window. Don't let them in. Don't let... Click. The line went dead. Ranger Miller didn't hesitate. He slammed the phone down, grabbed his keys, and yelled for two of the trail crew big men, loggers mostly, named Jim and Swede, to grab their gear. They loaded into the truck and tore up the logging road as far as it would go. It took them 2 hours to hike the 6 miles up to the lookout. It was dusk by the time they reached the final switchback. The sun had set, and the mountain was bathed in a bruised purple twilight. The lookout tower stood silent against the darkening sky. Miller, Jim, and Swede approached cautiously. They expected to find the door barricaded. They expected to find Thomas Braden huddled in a corner, suffering from altitude sickness or a breakdown. Instead, they found the door wide open. It wasn't kicked in. It wasn't broken. It was simply unlatched and swinging gently in the evening breeze. Braden! Miller shouted, drawing his flashlight. No answer. They climbed the stairs to the catwalk. The first thing Miller noticed was the scratching Braden had described. The wooden siding of the cab, specifically around the heavy glass windows, was gouged. But they weren't bear claws, and they weren't knife marks. The grooves were deep, parallel lines, stripped down to the raw white wood, as if something incredibly hard and sharp had been dragged over the surface repeatedly. They entered the cab. The Osborne Firefinder, the large, circular map table in the center of the room used to pinpoint smoke, was perfectly centered. A cup of coffee sat on the rim of the table. Miller touched it. It was stone cold, but there was a film on top, suggesting it had been sitting there all day. Thomas Braden's logbook was open on the desk. Miller shone his light on the page. The entries were standard, neat handwriting in blue ink, 8. All clear. Wait, Miller thought. He missed the call, but he wrote it in the log. 10. Visibility decreasing. Inversion rising. 12. Heard the bells again. Sounds like church bells. Coming from the canyon. 1400 fog lifted. Saw the shapes. 5 of them. Gray, tall, moving fast. And then, the final entry. It wasn't written in the neat columns. It was scrawled diagonally across the page, the pen having pressed so hard it tore through the paper. They burned cold. The cabin was otherwise undisturbed. Thomas Braden's pack was there. His boots were by the bed, which meant he had left the tower barefoot, Miller checked. No, his hiking boots were there, but his spare moccasins were missing. But here is the detail that the official report tried to bury. The detail that makes this case one of the most baffling in the history of the U.S. Forest Service. The windows. The lookout cab was glass on all 4 sides. To protect the glass during storms or winter, the lookouts had heavy wooden shutters that could be dropped down from the outside. To drop the shutters, you had to go out onto the catwalk, unhook them, and lower them. When Miller and his men arrived, every single shutter was down and locked from the outside. This meant that Thomas Braden, or someone else, had to have been standing on the catwalk to lower those shutters. But if Braden was inside the cabin making that phone call, describing things looking in, how were the shutters lowered? And if he had fled, why would he stop to lower and lock the heavy shutters before disappearing? They searched the mountain for 3 weeks. They brought in bloodhounds. They brought in hundreds of volunteers. The dogs picked up a scent at the base of the tower stairs. They followed it for about 50 yards down the rocky spine of the ridge, to the edge of a sheer cliff that dropped 2,000 feet into the bowl, the valley where Braden had claimed to see the shapes. At the edge of the cliff, the scent simply vanished. No footprints were leading over the edge, no disturbed gravel, no slide marks. It was as if Thomas Braden had walked to the edge of the world and simply ceased to exist. The FBI was briefly involved because of the wartime context. They suspected perhaps Braden had been a spy, signaling Japanese aircraft, and had been extracted. They tore apart his background. They found nothing. No debts, no foreign contacts, no secret life, just a quiet man who liked to read. However, they did find one piece of physical evidence that defied explanation. About a month after the disappearance, a hiker found a piece of clothing miles away, deep in the untracked wilderness of the valley floor, the place Braden had been so afraid of. It was a shirt, identified as Braden's service uniform. It wasn't torn, it wasn't bloody, it was burnt. But it wasn't burnt as it had been in a campfire. The scorch marks were on the inside of the shirt. The fabric was charred from the inside out. Yet the buttons and the pockets on the outside were pristine. It was as if the heat source had come from the body wearing it. The investigation was officially closed in 1943. The Forest Service listed Thomas Braden as missing, presumed dead due to accidental fall. They attributed his radio call to altitude-induced psychosis, or a mental break brought on by isolation. But the locals didn't buy it. The old-timers in the logging camps talked about the gray giants of the Cascades, spirits that looked like burnt trees but moved when you weren't looking. They said Braden didn't fall. They said he was taken. And Ranger Miller, he never worked dispatch again. He transferred to a district in the desert, as far away from the deep woods as he could get. Until the day he died, he refused to talk about the phone call. But his wife said that on stormy nights, when the wind howled around the eaves of their house, Miller would unplug the telephone. He couldn't stand the sound of the static. He was terrified that if he listened too closely, he might hear that scratching sound again. And he might hear Thomas Braden's voice, whispering the message that never made it into the official report, the words Miller heard just before the line went dead, which he took to his grave. I'm not burning, I'm becoming. So what really happened to Thomas Braden in the summer of 1942? Did the isolation break his mind? Did he stumble upon a Japanese saboteur unit deep in the woods? Or did he see something ancient and impossible in the fog that day? Something that required him to lock himself in, or perhaps lock the rest of us out? We will likely never know. The lookout tower on Iron Mountain was torn down in the 1950s. The wood was burned. But hikers who venture up to that jagged spine of rock still report a strange phenomenon. They say that when the fog rolls in and the sound of the world is muffled by the inversion, you can hear the faint rhythmic sound of metal scratching against stone. And if you look down into the valley, sometimes the trees seem to move just a little too fast. Whether it was the gray giants or the solitude that took him, the mystery of Station 4 remains unsolved. Help us keep the signal strong by liking this video and subscribing to Channel 19 Mysteries. I read every comment, so tell me what you think really happened up on that mountain. Also, I'm looking for listener stories. If you've seen something strange in the woods or had an unexplainable experience, write to me at mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. I'm Midnight Rider. Keep your eyes on the horizon and stay safe out there.